What happens when you take two traditional arguments to show the non-existence of God and combine them together? Do you get all the strengths and none of the weaknesses? Dr. Carl Brownson seems to think so. Welcome back, everyone. I was recently introduced to an argument formulated by Dr. Carl Brownson for his PhD dissertation. I was super excited to read this, as a new and original argument is admittedly hard to come across in theistic discussions about God, either for or against. And Brownson presents an ingenious and beautiful argument. Today I'll be presenting the argument, seeing if it succeeds based on the standards Brownson set up for himself, and then showing if it is a challenge to a follower of classical theism such as myself. Now, Brownson is of the view that by combining two arguments that are not as convincing, they become stronger than the sum of their parts. The two arguments in question are the ontological disprove and the problem of evil. And the fusion of these arguments goes as follows. If God exists, then he exists necessarily. If God exists necessarily, then nothing incompatible with God's existence is metaphysically possible. Evil incompatible with the existence of God is metaphysically possible. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, I actually like this argument, but that's partially because I have a loving relationship with ontological arguments. There's a beauty in them, I feel, made present in their simplicity. But many, I have come to realize, don't understand what an ontological argument is and what makes it different from other arguments for the existence of God. An ontological argument is derived from premises that are from reason alone, such as an a priori reason, analytical reason, or a necessary or self-evident premise. However, due to the nature of this, it is hard to follow or see what is happening. So, let's break it down premise by premise. First, if God exists, then he exists necessarily. This is taken from the nature of God, primarily as Leibniz defines him. The perfection of all attributes and exists necessarily. This is not proven or shown to be the case, but is taken as self-evident or as a definitional aspect of what we are exploring within the argument. Or in other words, if a God exists, this is what God would be. Now this makes sense, because if God exists, then he exists necessarily within his nature. We're now looking not just if there is a necessary existence, but if this specific kind of being does indeed exist. So, premise one is self-evident on what the nature of God is, and is simply stating that the nature of such a being is such a one that it exists necessarily. Second, if God exists necessarily, then nothing incompatible with God's existence is metaphysically possible. What does it mean to be metaphysically possible or impossible? In layman's terms, there's no contradiction. Now, ontological arguments are based on exposing two mutually exclusive ideas, aka God exists or God does not exist. Then, it exposes a contradiction if one of them is true, which is a metaphysical impossibility. And since contradictions can't exist in reality, we are then able to conclude that because one of the ideas has to be true, because again, if it is true that God exists, then it is false he does not exist, and vice versa. And if we find out that it is the case that the statement God exists leads to a contradiction, that means the statement God exists is false. We now know that the idea or statement that God does not exist is true. Incompatible here means that God cannot make something that contradicts his nature, which, is from the law of non-contradiction. The third premise, evil incompatible with the existence of God, is metaphysically possible. This is the crux of the argument and what Brownson spends the majority of his paper developing and justifying this idea. In a nutshell, he presents it in two ways utilizing modal logic. Specifically, using Leibniz's argument that this is the best possible world, he posits that there is evil incompatible with the existence of God. Now, to be clear, this is different from actually exists, which I'll get into why that is important in a moment. In Leibniz's argument, God is looking at all of the possible worlds that could exist. And then he selected this one and made it real, since it was the best out of all of them. Brownson argues that God wouldn't do something for no reason. Thus, he had to refuse those less good worlds because there is something in them that is incompatible with his goodness, which, again, according to Leibniz, is an essential part of God. Brownson further justifies this by defining two kinds of unjustifiable evils. The first and stronger kind is one which is unjustifiably evil in all worlds. The other kind, which he calls contingently unjustified evil, is an evil that might be justified in some worlds, but you remove that which justifies it, and now it is unjustified. Now, Brownson is convinced that there is a true unjustifiable evil, but all he needs for his argument to work is a contingently unjustified evil. For if there is a world without that justification for that evil, which is possible, then there is a possible world that contradicts the goodness of God. And if there is a contradiction or something incompatible to the existence of God in even just one possible world, then God can't exist. Now, this is the crux of the argument, like I said, and it's actually brilliantly done. Because of the nature of model logic and possible worlds arguments, like I said, if God could possibly exist in one world, then he must exist in all worlds. If he does not, then he is not a necessary existence. Since it is essential to God's nature to exist necessarily, then it is impossible for a possible world that is incompatible with his nature to exist. So if there is even a possibility of evil incompatible with God's goodness, another essential part of his nature, then that means there is a possible world that God can't exist in, which means that he does not exist in all possible worlds, which means he does not necessarily exist. Thus, God is a contradiction and cannot exist. To put it another way, if something is true in all possible worlds, then it is a universal truth. But if there is a world that it is not true in, then even if it is true in this actualized world, that doesn't make it a universal truth, but a contingent truth. For example, the law of identity seems to be a universal truth. A equals A. But if there was a world where it was possible that it is not true, then it is not a universal truth, but a contingent one. So this argument does not necessarily claim that there isn't a super powerful being that we mistook for God. But it does claim that what is traditionally claimed to be God, i.e. that which exists outside of all possible worlds and is one that actualized this specific one out of all of them, does not exist. Now, again, like I said, I like this argument, and to be 100% honest, it is clever, does a great job attacking the ontological argument put forth by Leibniz, and is valid. No fallacies have been committed, and if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. But is it sound? Does it attack and dismantle all understandings of God? Brownson seems to think so. In fact, he even explicitly calls out Thomistic Theists, saying that they might try to weasel out of the argument, but the conclusions still follow. Actually, in fact, that is why it was put forth to me, because the individual who had come across this argument was curious how a Thomistic scholar might respond to it. So, just like before, let us go through each premise and see how it works with Thomistic theology. Now, if you watched my video on Anselm's ontological argument, you might remember that Aquinas states that God's nature is not self-evident to us, even if it is self-evident to himself. So does Brownson make the same error Anselm did in his argument? Unfortunately, yes. While not immediately apparent from his premise, the justification he provides for that premise is that it is in God's nature to be a necessary being, which he provides no justification for other than that's what he is, which is a claim of self-evidence. So, in order for the first premise to be true in a Thomistic sense, that can't be the first premise. It needs to be the conclusion of an argument, which is then used to further the rest of the argument. But let's say we accomplish that. Let's say we prove the nature of God and that God exists. Could this argument work if we first establish that? Well, No, the reason this argument works so well is because we are trying to establish if God exists, and using the nature of evil that is compatible with his essence to show that it is a contradiction. So the original premise is effectively saying, if X, then Y. But if we, by not assuming the nature of God as self-evident, prove that the nature of God is what it is and that it exists necessarily, aka prove what the premise is assuming, then when we hit the contradiction, the whole relationship changes. How so? In the original argument, Brownson is convinced that evil incompatible with the nature of God exists, and he spends the majority of his paper proving that, or at least attempting to prove that. He acknowledges at the end that maybe it is the case that there is no such thing as an evil incompatible with the nature of God, but it seems incredulous to make such a statement based on what he has provided. In fact, he feels like that the only way to get out of this is by begging the question, where we assume that God exists. So in the original argument, we have a thing that could exist and something that we know exists. If there is a contradiction, then it is not the thing we know to exist that needs to be discarded, but the possible existence. So if we do premise one the way a Thomistic scholar would, then instead of the nature or existence of God being the possible existence in question, it is now the thing we know exists, and the evil incompatible with God's nature would be the possible existence that can be discarded. To use another example, let's say you're speaking with someone and we're trying to determine if we live in a simulation or not. Because we don't know that, any contradiction that we discover based on the evidence means that we can discard the premise of that we live in a simulation. But if it is demonstrated that we live in a simulation, and that is known to be true, then the evidence that is discovered that appears to contradict that statement either needs to be reevaluated, or we know that something is misunderstood in that. So already from a Thomistic perspective, the argument fails in the first premise without even needing to get into the area Brownson thinks we need to. The existence of evil incompatible with the nature of God. Now, I could end this here, but I think that Brownson misunderstands evil from this perspective, which also leads to his confidence in his argument being sound. As I have been alluding to, Brownson uses the argument and presentation of God from Leibniz's perspective, which Aquinas disagrees with that presentation wholeheartedly. In fact, Kant's critique on the ontological argument about existence not being a predicate was towards Leibniz, and would have had no effect on Aquinas' argument or view of God. Leibniz tried to argue that existence is a predicate that can be made more or less perfect. Kant points out that it is either something you have or don't. There isn't a case of degrees for existence like there is for redness or goodness. What makes this so damning for the third premise of the argument for Brownson is that in the Thomistic understanding, God is not the most perfect thing. God is being, or existence qua existence. He isn't even good in the equivocal sense that Leibniz and by extension Brownson use it. So because of that, the only thing that would be incompatible with the nature of God is something that is incompatible with, well, existence. Since the whole argument is about the goodness of God as his nature, and it being incompatible with some possible evils, but if the nature of God does not possess that goodness, then it doesn't matter how evil a thing is, it cannot be incompatible with the nature of God. Unless one shows how evil is incompatible with existence. This also doesn't get into how evil is understood in Thomistic theology. Tolkien famously summarized evil as, evil cannot create anything new. It can only distort and destroy what has been invented or made by the forces of good. So evil, in the Thomistic sense, doesn't exist. It is the corruption of things that do exist. It is like darkness. It's not a thing that does exist, even though we allude to it as existing. But rather, darkness is the measurement of the lack of an existing thing. So the further away from what it was meant to exist as, the more evil it is. So in a way, Brownson's uncomfortable truth that the theist would have to say that evil incompatible with the nature of God doesn't exist is actually, in a certain perspective, too weak of a claim for the Thomist. The nature of evil is that absence. It doesn't exist. Period. So in a way, evil is incompatible with the nature of God, but not in the way that Brownson talked about. It is so incompatible with existence that it actually doesn't exist. It's the measurement of the lack of it. So the conclusion that Brownson feels so ugly or unable to be accepted by the theist has been a part of the theistic tradition since, honestly, Augustine, if not earlier. The error comes in when one views evil as a thing that exists, which many people do, especially non-believers. However, in order for it to be a true incompatible situation, the proper definition needs to be applied. An example Brownson gives of a metaphysical incompatibility is a wooden table made of ice. He claims that this is incompatible. They don't outright contradict each other on first view, but due to the nature of wood and ice, they are incompatible and are mutually exclusive to each other. And in one sense, he's right. But that's because if something is ice in a particular sense, and wood is not ice, that's the contradiction. So the contradiction is if you were to claim that something is ice and not ice. Now, I can also tell Brownson probably didn't watch Mythbusters growing up. If he did, he might have remembered an episode where they talk about pykrete, which is a material made by Geoffrey Pyke in World War II and is an ice and wood composite that was purported to be as strong as concrete. And what do you know? Now we have a wooden table made of ice. The contradiction comes in if you were to try to say that something was wooden and not wooden, or something was made of ice and not ice. That's the difficulty in proving something as being incompatible, and not necessarily a contradiction. Either it actually is a contradiction, or they could work together in a way that isn't necessarily obvious to us. Now, due to Brownson not fully demonstrating and only alluding to the contingent incompatible evil, which, again, isn't how Thomistic Theists would define evil, without providing a specific demonstration of it, the argument is weaker due to the lack of clear definition. Ultimately, an ontological argument rises or falls on the definitions. Here, Brownson uses the definitions of God made popular by Leibniz and other individuals of pop Christianity, along with a popular but philosophically weak definition of evil, to show why Leibniz's argument fails. Now, if that was all he claimed to do, I'd applaud him and tell him good job. However, he claimed that this argument was sound and even Thomistic Theists would be trapped by it. Unfortunately, Aquinas had been playing a different game long before, and the terms used by Brownson are not the terms used by Aquinas, so they don't affect that position. Is there an argument out there that does affect Aquinas' position? As I was finishing up this script, I was shown the concept of existential inertia, which counters or attempts to counter a very strong point of classical Thomistic theology. I'm still looking into it as, like I said, it was just shown to me as I was finishing up this script, but make sure you subscribed if you like this kind of content and click that bell icon so you can be notified when it drops. Peace.